In this video, you're going to learn exactly how to enhance your recovery between rounds. Whether you're a boxer, MMA fighter, jiu-jitsu athlete, doesn't matter. We're gonna maximize this recovery period so you can maintain performance throughout the fight. And I won't be telling you to do more zone 2, contrary to popular rhetoric. Now, Nicky Rod, one of the best modern grapplers, gave great advice recently about training to recover between rounds for the AIGA competitions within grappling and by training for the rule set.
Mistake is they don't train to recover within the 1 minute. I believe that's important. Something you saw my CJI run, we have 15-minute match with 1 minute breaks every 5 minutes. I was able to recover heavily within the 1 minute. And in fact, I wore my whoop strap and I went from 178 beats per minute to literally like 80 beats per minute.
So structuring your live training to accommodate the rounds and rest so you can learn to regroup between rounds is one important piece of the puzzle. That's how you can structure your technical tactical training to meet the demands of the sport. But what about planning your conditioning to improve this? Because you can only get so far just doing rounds of your sport. Now, VO2 max is the current obsessive trend that, in my opinion, may not be as important as told, or at least the current training modality recommendations to improve VO2 max may not be as important. Within the endurance world, there are other factors that influence performance, such as task economy, and that would be, for example, if you're a runner, it would be running economy, cycling would be cycling. Within combat sports, it would be your efficiency of movement, and this typically includes oxygen use at sub-maximal speeds, which can be influenced by physical factors such as elastic qualities, your VO2 kinetics, specifically the speed of oxygen uptake. Remember that for later in this video. Now, according to Levin's 2008 paper, we see VO2 max is closely tied to oxygen delivery, which means that VO2 max is typically a great indicator of central function. So function at the heart, being able to pump more blood per heartbeat. That's often what is given as prescription for improving recovery between rounds. Just train to have a bigger heart, pump more blood, a better delivery system, and you're gonna improve your recovery, improve your aerobic ability. But there's another side to this story. If we look at the average VO2 max values presented in combat sports studies, they are not endurance athlete level. So let me take you through some examples. Looking at the VO2 max values of elite level amateur boxers, Indian boxers were measured to have an average VO2 max of 55 to 62 milliliters per kg per minute. So that's just the absolute measurement of VO2 max. I won't give the values for each and every one. But Hungarian boxers on average had a VO2 max of 57, Lithuanian boxers an average of 58. If we look at jiu-jitsu athletes, now jiu-jitsu is not a very good sport to look at when we're looking at physiological profiles because one, the research is very old, the game has changed. Two, it's not an Olympic sport or a professional sport, so you have, well, it is now, but it wasn't back then, and that means you don't have athletes training full-time typically, so you don't have a really good cohort of what a physiological profile of a good jiu-jitsu athlete is. It's more kind of done by belt levels, and as we know, a lot of jiu-jitsu athletes typically hobbyists, even at the brown black belt level. But typically, we see moderately trained jiu-jitsu athletes at around 45.6 milliliters per kg per minute. If we look at wrestlers, elite junior Iranian freestyle wrestlers, 50 to 57 milliliters per kg per minute. Regional and amateur MMA fighters in the USA show values of around 55 in the welterweight division, which seems to be on par with the UFC Performance Institute's data, their average VO2 max in their elite population around that level as well. Now, to put this into perspective, if we look at VO2 max data across sports with untrained and recreationally trained individuals, we see the bottom threshold being approximately 45 to 48 milliliters per kg per minute. And these values are taken from two papers. One from a 1967 paper by Bengt and Per Olof, hopefully I said that right, where they compared VO2 max of 19 different Swedish national team sports. So essentially 19 different sports, all the athletes from those sports comparing VO2 max values. The second paper is a 2013 paper by DePore, hopefully I said that right, and colleagues, who classified 5 different performance levels by VO2 max. And I'll throw a graph up here as well so you can see that. And as you can see, you've got 5 different performance levels from down the bottom all the way at absolute values of around just under 50, all the way up to closer to 75, 80 milliliters per kg per minute. Now, the first level of that under 50 was subjects who participated in physical activity less than 2 to 3 hours a week. So if you think about some of the VO2 max values I just ticked off, we're talking anywhere from 45 up to 58 in these instances. They'll be typically in the performance level 1 or 2 based on this research. In elite endurance sports, we're looking at performance levels of 4 and 5 on this graph, which is a VO2 max greater than 70, and achieving that, these subjects had hours and hours of slogging miles. And this is backed up by Hugh and his colleagues in 2000, who looked at regionally and nationally ranked versus elite triathletes who had an average VO2 max values of above 70 milliliters per kg per minute. So as you can see, as a overarching picture, combat athletes don't have huge VO2 maxes. So the question becomes, would specifically targeting training to boost VO2 max to elite level endurance athletes mean better recovery between rounds and overall conditioning? I liken this to strength training, where maximal strength is seen as the potential for upper force generating potential. Training to go from a 2 times bodyweight squat to a 3 times bodyweight squat may not improve your performance. Further, the time, attention, and recovery needed to get there, it also might not be conducive to other physical qualities that are important to combat sports, such as speed, power, rate of force development, and your conditioning. We can make the same argument regarding VO2 max, which is seen as an upper ceiling potential of your conditioning, where higher and higher volumes are needed to see change. Now, Chris Kirk, who's been on the podcast a couple of times, he's just published a new paper in MMA that may shed some more light on VO2 max and whether VO2 max is worth chasing. They took MMA athletes through sparring while wearing GPS to measure fighter activity. So if you've ever watched live team sports, soccer, rugby, American football, you can't really see it, but you'll see a little lump on the back of the top of their backs, or they'll wear something that looks like a sports bra. That's a GPS unit, and they'll use that to track a variety of metrics throughout training and games. For example, total distance run, the different speed zones, collisions, change of directions, accelerations, decelerations, all sorts of data. Within MMA, it's a little more difficult to do that, but there is one metric from the Catapult GPS that can potentially be used, and that is player load. And player load is a proprietary measurement from that one company. Essentially measures 3 directional movements, so forward, back, side to side, up and down, and you're able to get an arbitrary number from this player load. And that essentially quantifies movements in all different planes. So what they did is they took player load from sparring, and they found that relative VO2 max showed very large correlations with player load. So the quote unquote fitter the MMA athlete, the more active they were in these sparring bouts. So what they did to further break this data down is they split the cohort into a high and low VO2 max by splitting it by the median number. And the median number, or the middle number, was 53.3 milliliters per kg per minute. So above that, you'll be in the high VO2 group, below that, you'll be in the low VO2 group. And what they found was there was no differences between groups per round for either player load or player load per minute. However, though both groups' player load were generally equal in each minute of round 3, the top 50% group still had a moderate session RPE of around 6. So that will be a measure of internal training load. Essentially, how do you feel while sparring? While the bottom 50% had a higher session RPE or higher internal training load. And it meant that the quote unquote fitter group were able to push in those final couple of minutes in those rounds where the lower group couldn't. The differences in this RPE and external intensity, which is the player load, between groups may be due to aerobically fitter athletes having faster oxygen kinetics at the onset of exercise. Let me explain this just quickly. So this is stated in a mammoth study by Poole and Jones in 2012. It's titled Oxygen Update Kinetics. It's a beast of a paper, but essentially they state that quote unquote fitter athletes or athletes with higher VO2 max typically have faster oxygen kinetics, and I'll explain why that's important in a second. But bear in mind that VO2 kinetics don't improve once above an intermediate VO2 max, which is typically greater than 65. Now, Chris's study didn't measure oxygen kinetics during sparring, so it's just a theory about why these athletes were able to push in those final minutes. But there is one study that has looked at oxygen kinetics during sparring, which I'll get to in a second. But I asked Chris some questions about this paper, and he gave me some answers to break down further, but I'm gonna do that in its own video about that paper in the future, so I don't convolute this video about recovery between rounds with more about that study. But in essence, having a decent VO2 max is probably something you shouldn't ignore, but it probably doesn't need to be elite endurance level. And further, the methods you use to attain a higher VO2 max probably matters as well. And honestly, it's probably not a metric you should really focus on because it's something that happens as a side effect of good training. But This is where Dr. Andrew Usher and Dr. John Babry's research comes in. I've talked about this a lot. We've talked about it a lot on the podcast. I've also broken down the two studies separately. You can also watch, but I'm going to give a summary and how it fits into this recovery between rounds. So in their first paper in 2023, they measured oxygen kinetics during pad work, bag work, and sparring. This paper is titled The Use of NAIRS to Explore Skeletal Muscle Oxygenation During Different Training Sessions in Professional Boxing. And it gives us a deeper look at the physiology of what's happening within the muscle. VO2 max can't tell us that. So they stuck a NAIRS device. So essentially it's a little portable device that measures oxygen saturation within the muscle. And they put that on the rectus femoris, so one of the quad muscles of these professional boxers, while they did these 6 rounds of pad, bag, or sparring. No specific instructions were given other than to train how they usually would. I don't want to run through all the implications of the study because it's outside the scope of between round recovery, but I want to show you this one graph. And it shows muscle oxygenation during sparring from the 1st to the 6th round. And what you should really note on the very left y-axis is the starting percentage. So that is the skeletal muscle oxygenation percentage. You see it starts very high in the 1st round at around 70%. And by the 6th round, it's about 45%. The lower starting percentage from the 1st to the 6th round means these boxers are not recovering well. It means these boxers are not recovering well enough to maximize performance, essentially starting each round further and further in an oxygen deficit. You can also see the increase in time delay before that descent starts, indicating impaired mitochondrial activation. So if you look at this graph, you see the y-axis to the first dashed dotted line, and you see how much further that is on round 6. That is the time delay. There was also a reduction in fast resaturation rate, which is that line coming back up at the pause of exercise, which would be your round recovery, which is the muscle filling back up with oxygen, which means that they had impaired muscular recovery. And that is what we're talking about when we're talking about between round recovery. So why is this all important? Well, as I mentioned, VO2 max doesn't tell us this data. Well, while VO2 max may be a general indicator of overall fitness, it doesn't tell us what's happening at the muscular level. If we look at some of the research on these peripheral changes, Dindorf and his colleagues in 2023, they used NAIRS on forearms of sports climbers. So if you've watched speed climbing in the Olympics, basically that. And they found a rapid oxygen desaturation during static holds and resaturation at rest. So you get this nice wave in oxygen muscle desaturation resaturation with exercise. This will probably be more similar to grappling, where you're having strong isometric holds and having to release. For continuous exercise, running, cycling, etc. And in this case, boxing, which I'll touch on instead, we see oxygen desaturation, then equilibrium. If you remember from the graph I just showed you before, you see that little plateauing at the bottom, where a lower skeletal muscle oxygenation percentage is maintained. Funnily enough, this is the profile we see in boxing based on that research paper, even though boxing is viewed as an intermittent sport, at least from the oxygen kinetics of that rectus femoris muscle. And then finally, skeletal muscle oxygenation during a 1,000-meter kayak time trial is shown to be a better predictor of performance than VO2 max, which is very, very interesting. And I think provides potentially more value knowing this than knowing your VO2 max. Now, which brings me to sprint intervals. Talked about this a lot in the podcast, a lot in previous videos, but we're going to go into it again. Now, this isn't and shouldn't be the only thing you do. Various long and short intervals can emphasize targeting central adaptations at the heart, which may be better for increasing VO2 max and should be performed depending on your training schedule, upcoming fights, your athletic profile, etc. But I believe sprint intervals have been shunned for far too long for being quote unquote too short term. And if we look at a lot of the research around sprint intervals, a very classic one would be the Tabata study. We see values like VO2 max cap out at 3 weeks. Even in other research by Dr. John Babry in sprint intervals, we see VO2 max capping out early, but we see continual improvements and other factors that improve endurance performance, which I'll touch on. And I fell into this camp not too long ago around sprint intervals, but have since changed my tune on this based on a lot of this research. Now, Dr. Andrew Usher and Dr. John Babry's new study, which I broke down, shows interesting changes within the muscle. They performed 3 sets of 30 seconds sprints with 60 seconds rest twice a week for 3 weeks. So only 6 sessions, less than 5 minutes of total training time per session. Their testing protocol was an incremental run test to exhaustion, essentially a VO2 max test, with a NES device and intermittent inclusions after the run, and they found the increase in the area under the post-exhaustion skeletal muscle oxygenation curve, I've circled that on the graph at the end here, suggests faster refill of oxygen availability of the muscle post-sprints. That reflects a greater efficiency of oxygen use during recovery. If we go back to what I said earlier from the first study they did, the boxers weren't recovering well between rounds because the mitochondria, quote unquote, wouldn't switch off to allow the muscle to reoxygenate fast enough to be able to have a higher percentage of muscle oxygenation going into the next round. Just these 6 sessions of sprint intervals, they were able to improve that resaturation to be able to recover better after performing this incremental test to exhaustion. Hopefully that makes sense. But what about the VO2 kinetics? In Usher and Badbrai's first study, they show across rounds that time delay before skeletal muscle oxygenation starts to descend, it extends, meaning potential impaired mitochondrial activation. So remember I showed you to the first dashed line, to the dashed line in the second graph, you see that time extends. We want the mitochondria to work quickly and fast to speed up these oxygen kinetics, which reduces the oxygen debt and metabolic disturbance. So essentially we're able to get into the equilibrium faster, and that means we have less fatigue. Now, the study showed that 3 weeks of sprint intervals significantly improved mitochondrial rate function, meaning it switched on faster, and based on the resaturation, switched off faster. They also improved time to exhaustion during the incremental test, suggesting central adaptations did also occur. You're still getting potential improvements in VO2 max from these sprint intervals. And based on Dr. John Badbrai's 2017 research, we see time to exhaustion continuing to improve even through to 9 weeks of the same sprint interval protocol. Typically, you're not going to do the same one anyway for 9 weeks, but even just doing the same one, we still see improvements. So how do you program sprint intervals without all this fancy equipment? This is taken straight from Dr. John Badbrai in the podcast with him, but essentially pick equipment that allows a high cadence and high effort. Typically, this would be some kind of bike, air bike, watt bike, spin bike, whatever, or a grinder for upper body if you're doing upper body. You're looking at work intervals of 6 to 30 seconds in length. You're looking at total work time of 1 to 2 minutes and a rest of 1 to 2 to 1 to 8 work to rest ratio. For example, 10 sets of 6 seconds on, 30 seconds off. 10 sets of 10 seconds on, 20 seconds off. 3 sets of 30 seconds on, 90 seconds off, as examples. Where you place these within your training is going to depend on your training week, but typically directly after strength training, because it's so short, you can do it then. You can fit it in without having to do another session. Directly after sparring is another good place to put it, or directly after any other hard training. Typically, you don't want to put this on your easier days, just so you can consolidate your stresses into one day, so you're doing all your hard stuff on that day. Now, you can do this as a standalone session if you have the time, but typically doing it after a hard session is where it fits within a congested training schedule. Now, you can take all this information and create the perfect conditioning program, but if you aren't practicing your combat sport, often with intent and mindfulness, it's not going to matter. You need to have the skill set, efficiency of movement, the ability to read the game for this to transfer well. For example, if you're unable to control your mental state going into a fight, you have an adrenaline dump in the first minute, no amount of conditioning is going to save you anyway. But assuming your technical and tactical training is sufficient, planning your conditioning well will only help you. And this is why the sprint interval stuff, I think, is missing in a lot of athletes' programs. And a lot of them are stuck in this idea of slogging more miles on zone 2 to target these central adaptations, and then only doing really high intensity stuff, maybe on the mats, or doing high intensity work that's just not intense enough and not pushing yourself hard enough. So even 3 weeks of these sprint intervals, and they suck, trust me, is going to help you improve recovery between rounds. And you can go your entire fight camp doing these sprint intervals because you're still going to see improvements in endurance. Plus, you're going to have more time for training since these only take 5 to 10 minutes to do. You're still going to get some kind of central adaptation from these. And even though they are intense, because they're done on a non-impact piece of equipment, you will find you don't have a huge recovery deficit from doing these. You can do these and you can train an hour later and not feel like you just did a hardcore session, like if you're going to do a 30-minute high intensity interval session as an example. But I detail all of this as well below. They're free in the BJJ and MMA strength conditioning blueprint. I will have some more of those coming out, but those are free. You can get those down there, which covers a lot of this information about sprint intervals as well. If you enjoyed this, please like, comment below, and I'll see you in the next video.